It started on a bright Monday morning, the kind where sunlight catches on freshly mowed lawns, and the neighborhood seems perfectly ordinary. But for the narrator, what appeared to be an ordinary day quickly turned into the first scene of a tense suburban drama. An official-looking letter arrived, stamped with the HOA's insignia and signed by the board president, who had a reputation for rigid control over the neighborhood's every detail. The letter declared that a portion of the narrator's property had been selected for a new community garden, and that the HOA expected voluntary compliance, or else. At first glance, the idea seemed harmless, even appealing. A community garden could be a source of local pride, a place for neighbors to gather, and an environmentally friendly initiative. But as the narrator read the fine print, unease began to creep in. The community garden plan was vague, its boundaries undefined, and the letter carried an undercurrent of coercion. It suggested consequences if the property was not made available immediately, hinting at fines, legal notices, or even claims of community interest overriding private property rights. Something about the timing, the tone, and the sudden announcement set off warning bells. Curiosity turned into suspicion as the narrator began to notice patterns. The board president, a woman named Cynthia, had long been known for overreaching policies, small fines, and sudden mandates that seemed to serve personal interests more than community welfare. Several neighbors had quietly confided past experiences of harassment and questionable enforcement of HOA rules, but most kept silent, fearing retaliation. The narrator, however, had learned to read between the lines. There was more at play here than a simple gardening initiative. The property in question was the narrator's backyard, a modest but well-maintained space that had been landscaped with care over the years. Flower beds, a small vegetable plot, and a neatly arranged patio had turned the area into a private sanctuary. The idea that the HOA could simply designate a portion of this personal space for communal use, without consultation or clear compensation, felt invasive. Every detail of the letter hinted at something larger, a hidden motive that had yet to be revealed. That night, the narrator walked the property under the fading sunlight, imagining the community garden in action. The thought of strangers working on the lawn, of tools and irrigation systems installed without consent, stirred a sense of protective vigilance. Something didn't add up. The timing of the letter, the vagueness of the proposal, and the unusually aggressive tone all pointed to a plan that was designed to benefit someone else, rather than the community. The seeds of suspicion were planted. Over the next few days, the narrator observed the neighborhood carefully. People came and went in patterns that seemed orchestrated rather than incidental. Board members appeared more frequently than usual, surveying properties, taking notes, and making quiet phone calls. Conversations that should have been casual were curt, loaded with a sense of secrecy. The narrator's intuition suggested that the community garden was only a pretext. The idea of voluntary compliance was, in fact, a subtle form of coercion. The research began in earnest. Historical HOA documents, meeting minutes, and budget allocations were scrutinized. Patterns emerged. Proposals for land acquisition disguised as community projects, vague descriptions of public benefit in board resolutions, and recurring financial decisions that seemed to favor specific members or outside contractors. The narrator realized that the HOA had a history of framing personal gain as community interest, and that the new garden proposal might be the latest in a series of manipulations. Neighbors were quietly approached, their recollections lining up with suspicions. One described a similar initiative that ended with a large plot of land converted into a private contract with a landscaping company linked to the board. Another spoke of an unauthorized bench installation that conveniently increased property values for a board member's adjacent property. Collectively, these stories painted a picture of subtle exploitation, using the language of communal improvement as a veil for personal gain. The narrator began to consider the legal implications. HOA authority was not unlimited, and property rights were protected under state law. Yet, the board's influence and intimidation tactics could make contesting their claims daunting. Letters were drafted, documenting previous interactions, citing property boundaries, and referencing community rules. Simultaneously, surveillance measures were discreetly put in place, cameras positioned to capture any unauthorized inspections or activity on the property. The stage was being set for confrontation, but knowledge and evidence were critical weapons. Meanwhile, tension in the neighborhood became palpable. Cynthia and other board members, sensing resistance, began to increase their visits and communications. Notices became more frequent, phrasing more insistent. The narrator noted the subtle escalation. The friendly suggestion had shifted to repeated demands, deadlines, and implied penalties. The psychological pressure, a tactic the HOA had historically used to manipulate compliance, was now clearly being directed at the narrator. Resistance would not be passive. It would require careful, strategic action. As the days progressed, the narrator meticulously recorded every interaction. Notes on conversations, photos of signs or documents left on the property, timestamps of visits, and recordings of any verbal encounters. Each element contributed to a growing dossier of evidence. The focus was not simply confrontation. It was preparation for an inevitable turning point when the true plan behind the community garden would be revealed. Late one evening, the narrator reviewed the accumulated documentation, piecing together patterns that pointed unmistakably toward an ulterior motive. The land designated for the garden was oddly positioned to benefit a new commercial development proposal nearby. There were subtle hints of insider connections between board members and local contractors who stood to gain financially. The HOA's claims of public benefit were increasingly transparent as a veil over private interests. The narrator's suspicion was now a near certainty. The community garden was a pretext, and a personal or financial scheme was the actual agenda. The sense of urgency grew. The narrator understood that exposure, strategy, and public awareness would be necessary to protect the property. Covert recording of interactions, careful documentation of board communications, and gathering neighborhood support became central. Every detail mattered. The timing of letters, the phrasing of demands, the presence of outsiders on the property. The HOA's playbook was methodical, but predictable, and careful observation could turn its own tactics against it. By the end of the first week, the narrator had created a comprehensive map of all suspicious activity, visits, proposals, financial documents, and patterns of behavior that indicated a larger scheme. Each piece of evidence reinforced the growing narrative. The HOA was attempting to co-opt private property under the guise of a community project, but the real beneficiaries were select board members and associated contractors. The narrator realized that confronting this carefully, strategically, and publicly would be the only way to protect not just the property, but the neighborhood's integrity. The chapter closed with the narrator standing on the porch as the sun set, surveying the backyard that had been targeted. The tension in the air was tangible, a mix of anticipation, resolve, and wariness. The stakes were clear. The HOA's community garden was not what it seemed, and uncovering the true plan would require vigilance, strategy, and courage. The quiet suburban street had become the stage for a battle between private rights and hidden agendas, and the narrator was determined to expose the truth before it was too late. The morning light fell unevenly across Maplewood Lane, catching on freshly mowed lawns and the occasional decorative mailbox. To the casual observer, the neighborhood looked idyllic, quiet, and perfectly ordinary. But beneath the surface, tension had begun to simmer. The narrator's property, previously a peaceful sanctuary, was now the epicenter of suspicion and anxiety. The HOA's letter about the community garden had arrived days ago, and the thin veil of civic improvement had already started to unravel. As the week progressed, the narrator noticed subtle changes in behavior throughout the neighborhood. Board members, particularly Cynthia, moved with unusual frequency along the street, stopping occasionally at neighboring homes to exchange hushed conversations or check notes. Delivery trucks and landscaping vans appeared at odd hours, never staying long, but always present enough to be noticeable. It was almost theatrical, a quiet orchestration that suggested more than mere oversight. Each passing day confirmed that the garden proposal was likely a pretext, and the narrator's instincts sharpened accordingly. Determined to uncover the truth, the narrator began documenting everything. Mornings were spent walking the perimeter of the property, noting any signs of intrusion or unusual activity. Mailboxes were checked meticulously for letters, flyers, or notices slipped in with ambiguous intentions. Cameras were discreetly positioned, angled to capture any unauthorized visits or suspicious interactions without intruding on neighbors' privacy. Every recorded interaction, every timestamped note, would become a crucial piece of evidence. Research became the next layer of investigation. The narrator combed through HOA meeting minutes, past proposals, and financial records accessible through public filings. Patterns began to emerge. Several so-called community initiatives from previous years had ended with private contractors benefiting from board approval. One proposed park expansion years ago had resulted in a board member purchasing adjacent property at a fraction of its market value. Another neighborhood improvement project had been linked to a landscaping company repeatedly hired by the HOA without competitive bidding. The recurring theme was clear. Personal or financial gain had often masqueraded as communal benefit. Neighbors, long wary of the board's influence, provided further insight. Quiet conversations, exchanged with careful discretion, revealed a tapestry of minor injustices, fines, and coercion. A resident recalled that an optional HOA-approved garden had required her to pay installation fees, which ultimately went to a contractor with ties to the board. Another spoke of signage placed without consent, which inadvertently increased property values for a board member's nearby home. The narrator began to see the HOA's modus operandi, small, seemingly benign directives used to manipulate property, influence decisions, and generate opportunities for profit. Meanwhile, Cynthia's visits increased in frequency. She was rarely alone, often accompanied by other board members or contractors, ostensibly inspecting properties under the guise of garden planning. The narrator noted each visit with precision: time, duration, interactions, and even body language. There was a pattern, approaching from certain angles, focusing on specific parts of the property, and leaving behind letters that contained subtle, suggestive language. Every detail, when placed side by side, began to reveal a coordinated strategy. The narrator also explored the neighborhood context, tracing the proposed garden's location against future development plans in the area. Maps, zoning documents, and permits revealed a subtle alignment. The garden's intended footprint coincided suspiciously with a plot earmarked for a commercial project that would increase land value dramatically. The HOA's community interest argument, while superficially credible, clashed with the underlying potential for financial gain. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, suggesting that the community garden was not a garden at all. It was a cover for a profitable real estate scheme. Evidence collection became methodical and strategic. The narrator began recording interactions with the board, making sure to capture conversations, inspections, and any statements that could later demonstrate coercion or manipulation. Photos were taken of letters, signs, and minor disturbances on the property, creating a timeline that could demonstrate persistent pressure. Each action, though discreet, was purposeful. The goal was not confrontation for its own sake, but preparation for a decisive reveal when the board's true intentions could no longer hide behind euphemisms. Even mundane events were observed for patterns. Early morning visits, casual passings by, and dropped notices became data points. Contractors were noted by vehicle type, frequency, and apparent purpose. Each observation added a layer to the growing picture of premeditated strategy. The narrator understood that while the HOA relied on ambiguity and intimidation, systematic documentation could strip away their advantage. As days passed, the tension escalated. Board members began to adopt subtler tactics: vague warnings, suggestions of legal consequences, and appeals to community responsibility. The narrator noted each instance, recognizing the psychological pattern of coercion. The HOA's strategy relied on guilt, peer pressure, and the threat of bureaucratic action, rather than overt force. But each tactic was carefully recorded, creating a trail that would eventually expose the truth. By the end of the second week, the narrator had amassed a significant body of evidence: photographs, recordings, timestamps, and contextual research. It was clear that the HOA's community garden was a facade designed to extract control over a portion of the property under the guise of neighborhood benefit. But more importantly, the narrator now had the proof necessary to challenge it. Knowledge had replaced anxiety with strategy, and a plan was beginning to form. That evening, the narrator surveyed the backyard, walking the familiar paths lined with flower beds and vegetable plots. The sun cast long shadows, illuminating a space that had been threatened by unseen forces. Yet, standing there, a sense of empowerment emerged. The property was no longer just a backyard. It had become a symbol of resilience, careful observation, and the power of evidence. The garden proposal could no longer operate in secrecy. Its true purpose had been uncovered. The neighborhood itself seemed to sense the shift, as if the tension could be felt in the air. Neighbors who had once passed silently now offered subtle signs of encouragement: nods, waves, or small gestures that acknowledged the narrator's vigilance. While the HOA's plans remained hidden from public view, the narrator's determination was now matched by preparation and foresight. The confrontation, when it came, would be informed by fact, evidence, and strategy rather than conjecture. The chapter closed with the narrator reviewing the compiled dossier, each photograph and recording a thread in the emerging tapestry of truth. The HOA's tactics, once shrouded in intimidation and ambiguity, were now fully mapped and understood. The sense of anticipation grew, knowing that the next steps would require careful execution, but the stage had been set. The morning sun slanted across Maplewood Lane, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the tension thickening in the air. For the narrator, every detail of the neighborhood had begun to take on a different weight. Every truck, every passing neighbor, every lingering gaze carried the possibility of significance. What had started as a curious letter about a community garden had transformed into a full-blown investigation, and the truth behind the HOA's motives was beginning to reveal itself. With a carefully organized dossier in hand, the narrator reviewed the evidence collected over the past 2 weeks. Photographs, recordings, documents, and timestamps painted a picture of systematic manipulation. The HOA's repeated visits, sudden inspections, and subtle threats were no longer random. They were part of a pattern that suggested an underlying plan. The so-called community garden had little to do with plants and public welfare. Instead, its location, timing, and the contractors involved pointed toward a more lucrative endgame. Cross-referencing neighborhood plans and zoning proposals revealed the shocking reality. The garden's intended location aligned perfectly with a potential commercial development plot. The area was set to increase in value dramatically if the HOA could control it. Contractors associated with the HOA had histories of being awarded no-bid contracts on similar projects. Board members' real estate interests were quietly adjacent to the proposed site, suggesting a carefully orchestrated scheme to transform public pretense into private profit. Every detail lined up, and the narrator's suspicion hardened into certainty. The narrator's research also uncovered past community projects that had been used as cover for personal gain. An HOA-led park initiative 5 years prior had resulted in increased land value for board members' holdings. A small neighborhood art installation had included hidden clauses funneling maintenance contracts to a friend of the president. Patterns repeated, and the narrator realized that the current garden proposal fit the exact mold. Framed as communal good, but ultimately benefiting a select few at the expense of property owners' rights. With proof in hand, the narrator began formulating a strategy. The goal was clear: not only to defend the property, but to expose the HOA's hidden motives publicly before they could finalize plans. Surveillance footage and recordings were reviewed for incriminating details, carefully annotated with dates, times, and interactions. Every letter left at the doorstep, every inspection conducted without consent, and every veiled threat became part of a meticulously documented case. Observing the neighborhood, the narrator noticed a subtle shift. Certain neighbors, previously silent, seemed to watch more intently, whispering among themselves while walking past. The tension in the air had a palpable edge, as if the presence of scrutiny alone was starting to disrupt the board's usual rhythm. It became evident that once the HOA's tactics were challenged, secrecy and control would begin to crack under pressure. The next step required gathering more definitive evidence. The narrator devised a plan to record interactions with board members more openly, using concealed devices and capturing any statements that hinted at coercion or ulterior motives. Each recording was cataloged, time-stamped, and backed up securely. The narrator understood that even one unambiguous clip could be the turning point in exposing the board's duplicity. Every precaution was taken to ensure legality and admissibility, transforming careful observation into a strategic weapon. Meanwhile, the HOA's behavior grew increasingly erratic. Visits became more frequent, letters more urgent, and subtle threats more pointed. It was as though the board sensed the scrutiny and was accelerating its tactics, hoping to intimidate the narrator into compliance. The narrator noted each action, recognizing the psychological strategy: pressure through persistence. Yet, with evidence collected and patterns documented, the intimidation tactics now served only to reinforce the narrator's case. Every act of overreach was now a piece of undeniable proof. The narrator also began reaching out to the community discreetly and strategically. Quiet conversations with neighbors revealed additional anomalies: strange requests to prune certain trees, minor fencing modifications suggested without explanation, and even offers of compensation that carried hidden conditions favoring contractors. Collectively, these observations exposed a consistent pattern. The HOA was building a web of influence that manipulated property owners under the guise of communal benefit. By midweek, the narrator had mapped the garden area, showing its direct overlap with commercial plots likely to generate significant profit. Visual aids were created, combining maps, photos, and recordings to make the scheme unmistakable. The HOA's claims of community benefit were laid bare against evidence of self-interest, creating a compelling, unassailable narrative. Every document and recording aligned with the conclusion: the garden was a facade, a pretext for personal and financial gain. Despite the growing evidence, tension remained. The narrator understood that confrontation could provoke a response from the board, and that timing was critical. Any misstep could allow the HOA to adjust its strategy or hide incriminating actions. Strategy meetings were held, mental simulations run, and every possible reaction anticipated. The narrator's approach was deliberate, precise, and calculated. The ultimate goal was not just defense of the property, but the public exposure of the HOA's manipulative tactics. Late one evening, the narrator walked through the backyard, retracing every boundary, imagining how the garden would be implemented. The meticulous landscaping, the flower beds, and the vegetable plots were more than aesthetic. They symbolized personal ownership and investment. The thought of these spaces being co-opted under false pretenses fueled a renewed determination. If the HOA wanted a garden, it would have to be built on transparency and consent, not deception. The narrator reviewed all collected evidence one final time before nightfall: recordings of board visits, emails, letters, maps showing property overlap with commercial plots, and neighbor testimonies. Each piece reinforced the growing certainty that exposing the HOA's plan was possible. What had begun as suspicion had transformed into actionable knowledge. The tools of observation, documentation, and analysis were now weapons in a carefully planned strategy of exposure. By the close of Chapter 3, the narrator was ready to move from investigation to confrontation. Every piece of evidence was in place, every neighbor quietly aligned, and every board misstep recorded. The community garden had been exposed as what it really was: a veiled attempt to manipulate property rights for profit. The next stage would require courage, timing, and a public platform to shine a light on the HOA's hidden agenda. The tension in the neighborhood hung like a storm cloud, heavy but promising revelation. The narrator knew that the confrontation, when it came, would mark a turning point, not only for personal property rights, but for the entire community's understanding of the HOA's true motives. The stage was set, and the audience was waiting. The day began like any other in Maplewood Lane, yet the atmosphere had shifted. What was once a quiet, seemingly ordinary street had become a stage for power struggles, tension, and hidden agendas. The narrator, armed with a dossier of evidence meticulously gathered over weeks, understood that the moment for confrontation had arrived. Every photograph, recording, map, and timestamp would now serve as ammunition in a battle between personal rights and the HOA's manipulation. Morning light cast sharp shadows across the narrator's driveway, highlighting the carefully tended flower beds and vegetable plots, the very spaces the HOA had designated for their so-called community garden. Those boundaries, previously just lines on paper, had become symbolic battlegrounds. The narrator paced the backyard, double-checking camera angles and ensuring that every potential interaction with the board could be documented. The preparations were precise, calculated, and deliberate. There was no room for error. As expected, Cynthia and several board members arrived mid-morning, clipboard in hand, expressions a blend of authority and irritation. Their movements were purposeful yet cautious, reflecting a confidence tested by the narrator's documented vigilance. Every step they took was scrutinized, every gesture recorded. The cameras hidden in discreet locations captured their approach, the way they paused at the property line, and the subtle interactions exchanged among themselves. Even without words, the board's behavior conveyed tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that their plan might be under threat. The narrator's eyes followed their every move, mentally cataloging patterns of intimidation. These were tactics long used by HOA boards across neighborhoods, creating unease through persistent observation, subtle reminders of authority, and the implication of consequences for noncompliance. However, each tactic, previously effective in isolation, was now countered by evidence. The narrator had transformed vigilance into empowerment, and every attempt at intimidation was silently recorded for later exposure. Neighbors, long wary of the HOA's influence, were now quietly observing from safe distance. Some nodded in encouragement, while others lingered in the periphery, curious and cautious. The narrator had begun to understand that a subtle shift in the community's awareness was already taking place. When those who had once been silent began to notice, the HOA's influence began to waver. In this growing collective consciousness, intimidation lost much of its power. The board members moved toward the designated garden space, ostensibly to inspect its suitability. The narrator's cameras captured their actions in crisp detail. Measuring tapes extended, clipboards consulted, casual glances exchanged that hinted at calculation rather than genuine concern for community benefit. Every step told a story. This was not about gardening, it was about control. The recordings, taken over multiple days, would soon reveal a pattern undeniable even to casual observers. In the days leading up to this moment, the narrator had prepared visual aids, maps highlighting the overlap between the proposed garden and high-value plots, evidence of financial connections between board members and contractors, and documentation of past projects that mirrored the current scheme. These materials were organized to create a coherent narrative, a demonstration that exposed manipulation behind the guise of community service. The confrontation was no longer just verbal. It was visual, factual, and strategically undeniable. As the board inspected, subtle signs of frustration began to surface. Their previous confidence, rooted in assumed compliance, faltered under the weight of scrutiny. The narrator observed every glance, every hesitation, every brief pause where their composure threatened to slip. These micro-expressions revealed what the cameras would later capture in clear detail: the cracks in their authority, the insecurity behind their previously unchallenged power. The community garden pretext, once presented as an opportunity for civic engagement, now hung in the air like a fragile facade. The narrator, standing firm in their own space, became the anchor of resistance. Each photograph taken, each angle captured, served not just as documentation, but as a shield against manipulation. The HOA's previous tactics of persistent pressure, letters, and veiled threats were met with meticulous observation, reducing their power to mere theatrics. Neighbors began to drift closer, their curiosity and support increasingly visible. Their presence, though quiet, added another layer of accountability. Every board member's step, every gesture, every note scribbled on a clipboard was now witnessed, not only by the narrator's cameras, but by those who had quietly been watching from across the street. This collective awareness would amplify the impact of any future exposure, turning what might have been a private dispute into a public revelation. By midday, the HOA's inspection concluded, leaving behind more questions than answers. Subtle inconsistencies in their explanations were captured on video, the timeline of visits clearly documented, and patterns of repeated behavior meticulously annotated. The narrator's strategy was unfolding perfectly. The evidence had been collected, the observation complete, and the stage now set for a public confrontation that could not be ignored. That evening, as the sun cast a warm golden glow across the neighborhood, the narrator reviewed every piece of documentation one final time. The recordings showed the board's behavior in real time. The maps illustrated the garden's true strategic location, and neighbor testimonies confirmed the pattern of manipulation. The moment of exposure was approaching, and the narrator felt a sense of both anticipation and cautious optimism. What had begun as suspicion had evolved into a powerful narrative supported by irrefutable evidence. The narrator understood that confrontation alone was insufficient. The next phase would require public visibility, a platform where the HOA could not hide behind authority or bureaucratic language. The plan was to present the evidence in a way that illuminated the truth for the entire community, exposing the hidden motives while demonstrating that vigilance, documentation, and strategy could overcome intimidation. As darkness fell, Maplewood Lane seemed quieter, almost suspended in anticipation. The backyard, once a private sanctuary threatened by overreach, had become a symbol of resilience and careful preparation. Every flower bed, every vegetable plot, every corner under surveillance was now a testament to the narrator's resolve. The HOA had entered the narrator's space, unaware that their actions were being meticulously recorded and analyzed. By the end of Chapter 4, the stage was set for public exposure. The evidence had been collected, the community had begun to notice, and the HOA's confidence had started to erode under the weight of scrutiny. The confrontation had moved from private observation to documented challenge, and the next step would transform suspicion into revelation. The narrator's vigilance, preparation, and strategic foresight had created an environment where truth could not be ignored. The morning air carried a tense stillness over Maplewood Lane. Word had begun to spread quietly among neighbors. Whispers of the HOA's questionable tactics, the proposed garden's suspicious location, and the narrator's meticulous documentation. What had been a private investigation was now ready to move into the public eye. Today, the neighborhood would no longer remain silent, and the HOA's carefully maintained facade of authority would be challenged head-on. The narrator arrived early, ensuring that every camera angle, visual aid, and piece of evidence was organized and ready for presentation. Photographs of the property, recordings of repeated inspections, emails, and letters from the HOA were all compiled into a coherent timeline. Maps highlighting the garden's alignment with potential commercial development plots were carefully annotated, revealing the hidden financial incentives behind the proposal. Every item was deliberate, designed to tell a story of manipulation and control that could no longer be concealed. Neighbors began arriving, quietly at first, then in growing numbers. Curiosity mixed with cautious optimism, as the community sensed that something significant was unfolding. Some had previously been intimidated by the HOA, hesitant to question the board's authority. But now, armed with the narrator's evidence and the knowledge that the truth was on display, a collective sense of anticipation and empowerment spread through the crowd. The stage for confrontation had been set. As the HOA board members approached, the difference was immediately noticeable. Their earlier confidence, rooted in assumed control over the neighborhood narrative, had waned. They had expected compliance, silence, and unchallenged authority, but what they encountered was a community primed for awareness. The narrator's visual aids and documentation were displayed, arranged to tell the story in a clear, undeniable sequence. Every visit, letter, and recorded interaction now formed a tapestry of persistent overreach and hidden agendas. The board members' expressions shifted visibly. Glances exchanged among themselves betrayed uncertainty, frustration, and the beginnings of panic. Their confidence, once so assured, now teetered under the weight of public scrutiny. The neighbors, observing in real time, began murmuring among themselves. Stories previously shared quietly now resonated with the evidence presented, creating a collective acknowledgement of what had long been suspected. The HOA's community garden was not a benevolent plan, but a strategic move to benefit a select few at the expense of property owners' rights. The narrator's evidence left no ambiguity. Photographs of inspections, recordings of subtle threats, and documented patterns of overreach painted a clear picture. Maps revealed the overlap between the proposed garden and commercial plots linked to board members' financial interests. Letters once written as formal suggestions now appeared as thinly veiled instruments of pressure. The narrative was undeniable. The HOA had misrepresented its intentions, and the truth was now visible to everyone. Neighbors began contributing, sharing their own experiences of intimidation, fines, and coerced compliance. These accounts, previously hidden behind fear and hesitation, were now reinforced by the narrator's documentation. The collective testimony created a pattern of abuse and manipulation, confirming that the HOA's tactics extended far beyond the narrator's property. It was a revelation that challenged not only the specific garden proposal, but the board's broader authority over the community. The tension in the air was palpable. The board attempted to assert authority, offering explanations and justifications, but their words faltered under the weight of evidence. Every counterpoint, every defensive gesture was captured on the cameras and observed by the neighbors. The HOA's credibility began to crumble visibly as the once unquestioned power structure was exposed for what it was, a system leveraging pretense, coercion, and selective enforcement to pursue personal gain. As the presentation continued, the narrator highlighted the most compelling aspects: repeated visits timed to pressure compliance, overlapping property plans indicating financial motives, and inconsistencies in the HOA's communication. The narrative was methodical, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. Each piece of evidence connected to the next, forming a clear chain of cause and effect that illuminated the board's true intentions. The crowd's reactions were immediate. Whispers turned to nods of agreement. Expressions of concern shifted to solidarity, and a sense of shared purpose emerged. For years, many had felt powerless against the board's authority. Now, armed with the narrator's evidence, they realized that collective awareness could challenge entrenched power. The proposed garden, once a symbol of HOA control, had been transformed into a catalyst for transparency and accountability. By mid-afternoon, the full extent of the HOA's scheme was undeniable. The narrator's evidence had revealed the hidden agenda. The garden was a cover for real estate manipulation, designed to increase property values for a select few while presenting a veneer of community benefit. The neighbors, now fully informed, began demanding accountability. The atmosphere shifted from passive observation to active engagement. The HOA board's attempts at damage control were met with skepticism and growing dissent. The turning point arrived when the visual aids were compared directly with zoning documents and commercial development plans. The alignment between the proposed garden and potential profitable plots left no room for ambiguity. What had been framed as civic improvement was, in reality, a strategic maneuver for personal gain. The community's outrage, quiet until now, found validation in tangible evidence. The narrator had transformed suspicion into clarity, fear into empowerment, and observation into action. By evening, the neighborhood had transformed. Conversations, once whispered behind fences, now echoed openly through driveways and sidewalks. The HOA board, once imposing and confident, was visibly shaken. Their plan to quietly co-opt the property had been dismantled by careful preparation, diligent documentation, and strategic public exposure. The narrator had not only protected their property, but ignited a movement toward transparency and accountability across Maplewood Lane. The chapter closed with the narrator reviewing the day's events, photographs and recordings secure, maps clearly annotated, and neighbor testimonies logged. The evidence was now public, the HOA's authority questioned, and the community mobilized. What had begun as an investigation into a seemingly innocuous garden proposal had evolved into a neighborhood-wide revelation of manipulation and corruption. The stage was set for the final chapter: resolution, reform, and the reaffirmation of property rights. The sun rose slowly over Maplewood Lane, casting golden light across a neighborhood that, until recently, had been under the shadow of quiet coercion and subtle intimidation. What had started as a suspicious letter about a community garden had escalated into weeks of meticulous investigation, confrontation, and public exposure. The narrator, having collected evidence of repeated overreach, hidden agendas, and financial manipulation, now prepared for the culmination of a battle that had engaged not only themselves, but an entire community. The day of the official HOA meeting arrived. Unlike previous gatherings, this one was different. The community had been alerted, neighbors aware of the underlying motives behind the garden proposal. Where once only a handful of residents attended board meetings, now the room was full, voices hushed, but eyes determined. Chairs were occupied by homeowners previously intimidated into silence, each person aware that today, transparency and truth would dominate over deception. The HOA board entered, their demeanor carefully measured but noticeably strained. The board members, once confident in their authority, were now confronted with the visible consequence of weeks of documentation, recordings, and strategic exposure. The air was thick with anticipation. The once unquestioned authority of the HOA had begun to crumble. The board's plan to quietly secure the property for commercial advantage was now laid bare before the entire neighborhood, leaving them to face public scrutiny and growing outrage. The narrator presented the compiled evidence systematically. Recordings of repeated inspections, letters and emails highlighting coercive tactics, maps demonstrating the garden's alignment with profitable commercial plots, and photographic proof of the board's ongoing manipulation. Each piece of evidence was accompanied by timestamps, annotations, and cross-reference details that left no room for plausible deniability. The narrative that unfolded was not only meticulous, but undeniable. The garden proposal was a cover for self-interest, not public good. As the presentation continued, murmurs among the audience grew louder. Neighbors exchanged knowing glances, some shaking their heads in disbelief at the board's previous actions, others expressing relief that the truth was finally exposed. What had been private suspicion had now evolved into collective awareness. The board's earlier tactics of subtle pressure, threats, and ambiguity were powerless in the face of meticulously documented evidence and a community ready to demand accountability. The HOA's attempts to justify their actions faltered under the weight of facts. Every explanation was countered by tangible proof of prior misconduct or financial entanglement. Their credibility, once so firmly established, had begun to erode visibly. Micro-expressions betrayed unease, whispered discussions indicated panic, and attempts to shift blame fell flat in a room increasingly aware of the systemic pattern of manipulation. The narrator's careful preparation had transformed fear into empowerment for every homeowner present. Neighborhood members began sharing their own experiences, many of which mirrored the narrator's findings. Stories of petty fines, unsolicited inspections, and vague threats were no longer isolated. They formed a pattern consistent with the narrator's documentation. Each account reinforced the collective understanding that the HOA had repeatedly overstepped its bounds, leveraging the guise of community improvement for personal or financial gain. The board's authority was challenged not by one voice, but by the power of an informed, unified community. By mid-afternoon, the meeting had shifted from confrontation to consequence. The HOA board was confronted with a clear choice: accept accountability, revise their plans, and implement transparency, or face further legal and social repercussions. With evidence laid bare and community pressure mounting, the board could no longer rely on their previous strategy of quiet intimidation. The narrator's methodical exposure had forced the issue into the public domain, where concealment was impossible. Decisions began to take shape. The community garden proposal was immediately suspended. Plans that could have resulted in financial gain for board members were put on hold, and a full review of property and project management was initiated. The HOA's leadership was restructured. Board members found to have conflicts of interest or engaged in manipulative practices were removed or suspended pending investigation. Transparency measures were implemented to prevent similar abuses in the future. Policies were revised to ensure that every proposed neighborhood project would require clear, documented consent from all affected homeowners, preventing unilateral action disguised as community benefit. The atmosphere began to shift from tension to relief. The neighborhood, long subdued under subtle coercion, was reclaiming agency over its own spaces. The narrator, who had navigated weeks of investigation, confrontation, and strategic exposure, watched as neighbors reconnected and discussions shifted toward genuine community planning rather than manipulation. The flower beds and vegetable plots once threatened by the garden proposal were now symbols of resistance, oversight, and homeowner empowerment. In the days following the meeting, the neighborhood began to heal and rebuild trust. New policies ensured fairness in decision-making, regular community consultations became standard, and residents began actively participating in neighborhood planning with newfound confidence. The HOA's previous culture of secrecy and intimidation was replaced with transparency, accountability, and respect for individual property rights. The narrator's meticulous preparation had catalyzed systemic change, proving that careful observation, documentation, and courage could shift the balance of power in even the most controlled environments. The narrator reflected on the process, from suspicion to evidence collection, from private confrontation to public exposure. The journey had demonstrated the importance of vigilance, critical thinking, and community solidarity. What began as a single property threatened by an overreaching HOA had transformed into a movement that restored fairness, transparency, and trust across Maplewood Lane. The power of truth, documented carefully and shared strategically, had overcome manipulation, fear, and secrecy. The neighborhood slowly returned to normal life. Children played safely, gardens flourished, decorations returned to front yards, and neighbors engaged openly with one another. The once intimidating presence of the HOA was now tempered by accountability, and property rights were respected with clear enforcement measures. The narrator's perseverance had ensured that the community would not face similar covert manipulation in the future. Finally, the narrator stood on the porch, looking out across the street. The once tense neighborhood now radiated calm, resilience, and reclaimed agency. The HOA had been held accountable, the board reshuffled, and the community empowered to make informed decisions about its shared spaces. The garden that had sparked fear and suspicion had catalyzed transparency and justice. In the quiet of the evening, with the sun setting over Maplewood Lane, the narrator reflected on the journey. Evidence, preparation, and courage had turned suspicion into action and action into change. The story of the threatened property had become a story of community strength, vigilance, and accountability. The HOA's overreach had been exposed, fairness restored, and the neighborhood, once under a shadow of manipulation, was finally free to thrive on its own terms. The journey had concluded, justice had been served, and the community's trust had been restored. And for anyone watching this story unfold, remember the power of standing up, documenting truth, and holding authority accountable. Subscribe, like, and share for more unbelievable HOA and neighborhood drama stories.